welcome to the Leadership Bootcamp podcast. This is Jeff Strauss. Today, I'll be speaking about why traditional corporate leadership training is largely ineffective. This episode of the podcast is aimed at a corporate audience, but if you're not in the corporate space, you might still find this useful if you've ever had your job bring in a company to conduct any kind of skills training. So let's start with a question. Do you remember anything from the last corporate training you sat through? Think about it. Do you remember any salient details about the trainer's face, much less anything they said? What about a slide or a group discussion? If you're like me, and I assume like most people, the answer is you don't remember anything. And there are obviously many problems with that, the least of which is the money that companies are spending in good faith to educate their employees and improve their performance with training that might have good content, but is delivered ineffectually. So today we're going to explore several reasons why the traditional approach fails and what can be done to improve it. So first, let's take a look at the traditional approach. Generally, a company will identify a need or a gap. This is called gap analysis, identifying that need or gap that requires training to address. So recently at my company, we had training on a concept called change management. Now, change management means a lot of different things depending on the context, but in our context, it meant helping employees handle turbulence in the workplace due to things like organizational changes, rapidly changing priorities, and other workplace characteristics that cause stress or unease to employees. So our company found a third-party company to give a 1-hour presentation on essentially how to handle stress. My critique isn't of the quality of information, which was decent, but on the methodology as a whole. So our company is going through a turbulent time, as are many in the tech industry, and there are many signals that it's affecting the workforce. I won't go into detail of those signals, but suffice to say that from a gap analysis perspective, it was clear that a learning program on how to handle this turbulence was necessary. However, one major problem at the outset was there was no assessment of the employees to determine what our level of knowledge about the topic was prior to scheduling the training. So this is a problem because the presenter has no idea how to tailor the information based on the prior knowledge of the audience. So the presenter had no idea if the information being presented is even that really relevant at all. And while it seems intuitively obvious, there's also data that suggests that learners with high prior knowledge of a subject benefit less from structured learning environments, while those with low prior knowledge need more structured, guided approaches, meaning a one-size-fits-all approach where you have a slideshow and you're going through, your objectives for the meeting, and everybody follows the same slide format, and everybody's in the same breakout session, and everybody, regardless of what skill level, does what. You're ineffectually delivering training to those people that already have a high level of skill or knowledge about the subject, and so are deriving less from that type of training, whereas it's really geared towards a person with less knowledge. So not having that prior knowledge assessment is a problem. When it comes to learning, remember the Goldilocks principle. Training should be neither too difficult nor too easy for the learner's experience level, and you'll never know what that is without an assessment of prior knowledge. There are a few approaches to solving this problem. You can do it with like a low-stakes diagnostic assessment, like a questionnaire, or there can be moderated discussions among employees that can uncover beliefs, assumptions, and existing understanding of the topic so that the training can address those. Or beginners could receive guided learning, while more advanced participants can engage in self-directed projects or more exploratory learning. Now, however it's done, assessing prior knowledge is crucial to designing meaningful instruction, and too often in corporate training programs, prior knowledge assessment is just never done, and it's a tremendous limitation to the efficacy of training. Now, another problem with a one-size-fits-all approach, or one that doesn't do any form of assessment prior to training, is that it overlooks the cultural differences among participants, and this has major implications for successful leadership. Leaders from different cultures and backgrounds may express their leadership styles differently, and misalignment between a leader's style and the cultural expectations, either those of the society in which they live or the company for which they work, or both, can lead to reduced effectiveness through those misunderstandings, or in really bad cases, decreased team morale and engagement. Leadership training should be designed to reflect the cultural needs of the business and industry specific challenges. Culturally aware training also helps develop leaders that can navigate global markets more effectively, build strong international partnerships, and adapt strategies to the target locale. Increased employee engagement is also a result of culturally aware leaders, and I won't go into depth on this topic, but for more information on employee engagement, you can see my video on the topic in my lecture series on my website, jeffstrauss.net. Also, in my series on effective team management, you can find information on ethical decision making. Now, in short, culturally informed leaders can make ethical decisions better, and those greatly impact engagement and morale. Again, a solution here is to tailor training programs to consider the individual development needs of the leaders and the organizational culture. And without a prior knowledge assessment, which traditionally you do not find in corporate training programs, particularly those delivered by third parties, it's just not possible. My next critique is on the cognitive load of training. Cognitive load refers to the amount of mental effort required to process information and use your working memory. The most common metaphor used when discussing cognitive load theory is the computer. The more applications the computer is running at once, the less efficient it becomes, generally. Similarly, when the brain's cognitive load is high, learning becomes less efficient. Third-party leadership training features extensive material covered in a relatively short time, and that can be overwhelming, particularly, again, if prior knowledge on the subject is low, which, once again, the trainer would never know unless prior knowledge assessment is done. This isn't a deep dive into cognitive load theory because I'm not qualified to talk on that subject, but I do know that according to the most current research, humans have a small capacity for storing items in working memory, only about 5 to 9 things at a time, and it lasts only a short time, about 5 to 15 seconds, if we don't do something with the information. And do something means like rehearse it or use our prior knowledge and experience to wrap around new knowledge to incorporate it into something more meaningful and familiar. In other words, if we're looking at bullet points on slide number 7 of 31, and the next slide moves on to another concept, we are incapable of retaining that information, much less incorporating it into our lives after the presentation is over. This fact immediately nullifies any value of the training. The best way to combat cognitive load or cognitive overload is with the principle called segmenting. It's also called sometimes chunking. Segmenting is breaking the material into smaller, more manageable segments, allowing the learner to process the information in chunks. The efficacy of this principle is maximized when instruction is spaced out over time, perhaps a few weeks, so that learners can start to incorporate segments of the material in their work processes and then build on their knowledge over time. This, of course, begins to transform a 1-hour, quote, training, unquote, into a learning program, which is far more beneficial for workplace performance, and also something you don't typically see from a third-party leadership training provider. Now, another problem with traditional corporate training is the lack of focus on active learning. Often the delivery method of the training relies heavily on lectures, seminars, or static content like slides that don't actively engage participants in applying or practicing the skills that they're learning. These passive formats lead to shallow learning because they're not conducive to the participants organizing and integrating their new knowledge again with any prior knowledge, even if that prior knowledge is gained from the training itself. So these passive formats can be transformed into active learning by requiring participants to apply knowledge in context with strategies like case study review, role playing, or other hands-on exercises, which help foster deeper understanding and retention. To make this even more powerful, participants should engage in problem-solving activities that mirror real-world leadership challenges. This can also improve knowledge transfer because learners can use these opportunities to apply new skills in previously unknown realistic contexts. When it comes to breakout sessions, which are a favorite mechanism of these types of training programs, they're often too short and lack structure, and they rarely guide learners through the critical process of integrating new knowledge into existing frameworks. So if you're going to use a breakout session, or if these leadership programs use breakout sessions, or if you are in learning and development and are developing a learning program and you want to include breakout sessions, which I personally love, provide participants with frameworks or models that they can use to guide their thinking and allow them to scaffold their understanding during discussions. No two organizational contexts are the same, and leaders must be prepared to lead in whatever context they find themselves. So being able to leverage knowledge in new contexts is crucial. It's a crucial skill, and it requires development. The phrase I like to use at the beginning of my instruction is, "You can't learn to drive a car by reading the owner's manual. You must get behind the wheel." The corporate training programs that are out there today must be designed for learners to actively participate, learn from mistakes, and have access to guidance when things are becoming unmanageable. Corporate training programs usually lack all three of those characteristics. Corporate training programs generally also lack a continuous assessment and feedback process, and this is partially due to the ephemeral nature of the training. And what I mean by ephemeral is that in practice, a meeting will appear on an employee's calendar inviting them to participate in a training session, which is never to be seen again. It's a one-time event. Without reinforcement over time, leaders are less likely to retain and apply new skills, and the impact of training is dampened, to say nothing of the business outcomes that just won't be achieved. The other side of this coin is that the company that's putting on the training for their employees doesn't seek feedback in a structured way, so there's no opportunity to improve subsequent sessions based on the experiences of the learners. And without a formal assessment after the training, it's quite impossible to gauge the employee's understanding of the context. There are many ways to solve this problem, like integrating real-time assessments like quizzes, polls, or reflective exercises at key points during the training, which will allow participants to test their understanding and receive immediate feedback, which is crucial to the learning process because it enables learners to internalize the material. This also allows the trainer to adjust the course content based on the performance of the attendees, which is a very powerful mechanism. Programs that provide continuous feedback loops result in better business outcomes than those that provide end-of-course evaluations or nothing at all. I also think it's tremendously important that leadership training be a process and not a product. Follow-up workshops akin to continuing education credits for other professions, coaching and mentoring programs, and on-the-job assignments can encourage leaders to apply new skills in real-world situations. For more information on this topic, I suggest a trip into Kirkpatrick's 4 Levels of Training Evaluation, which is a framework for evaluating the effectiveness of training programs and is available on YouTube if you're interested in a deep dive. It's YouTube, Google if you're interested in a deep dive. So far in my critique of common leadership programs, I've discussed the lack of prior knowledge assessment, a huge part of determining how to effectively design the training program, which leads to the second issue, a one-size-fits-all approach. Then there's the problem of cognitive load, which is bombarding the learner with a ton of information that there's very little chance any of it will stick, and even less of a chance it will be implemented to affect a business outcome. Then I discussed active learning and how most leadership training is passive asking an employee to look enthusiastic at a slideshow, but not actually engaging with the content, and very often not even engaging with one another. And almost last, but not quite last, I talked about how omitting a continuous assessment and feedback loop is detrimental to the learning process. So we're going to discuss two more topics. One is a very common failure of leadership training, poor measurement of outcomes, and the other is executive involvement in training. So let's discuss poor measurement of outcomes. Now, organizations can't determine the effectiveness of their training programs without evaluation methods. Post-training measurement. Now, this is post-training measurement, not necessarily assessment. Post-training measurement is arguably the most difficult but most important part of the training process, because improving outcomes is what the training is all about. I will say that again because it's crucially important. Improving outcomes is what the training is all about. And in all my years in industry, it's more than 20 years at some of the most recognized companies in the world, I have never once been made aware of or otherwise participated in establishing clear metrics or key performance indicators aligned with business objectives to evaluate the effectiveness of a training program. Evaluating training outcomes is not merely a bureaucratic exercise. It is a critical process that ensures the effectiveness of leadership development initiatives. Without systematic evaluation, organizations cannot derive the insights necessary to determine whether their training programs are effective at all. By establishing clear metrics and KPIs, leaders can quantitatively assess the impact of training on both individual performance and organizational objectives. Post-training evaluations also enable data-driven decision-making. Metrics can include performance indicators like reduced employee turnover, increased sales, higher customer satisfaction ratings, cultural improvements, or improved team engagement, all of which can be directly correlated to enhanced leadership capabilities. This also fosters a culture of continuous improvement because metrics, or KPIs, encourage leaders to reflect more deeply on how to refine their skills to meet or achieve these measurements. Now, this is an important leadership skill. It's called metacognition, and it's the ability to think about our own thinking. And reflection is a crucial tool to not only self-improvement, but particularly leadership development improvement. You develop your own leadership skills much more effectively if you think about how you're thinking about leadership. Measuring outcomes also helps training programs remain relevant. Most importantly, are tightly aligned with the evolving goals of the business. Development of robust metrics and KPIs are indispensable for translating training into tangible success. The third and fourth level of Kirkpatrick's 4 levels, which I mentioned just a moment ago, relate to performance metrics, tangible outcomes, and aligning training with the needs of the business. A well-designed training program should not omit these crucial details. Now, I'll round out this episode of the podcast by calling back to the very beginning, my recent experience with a training session on change management. Leadership training, particularly the expectation that leaders learn new, perhaps different ways of leading, can be met with resistance. A well-established supporting structure from the top levels of the organization should champion training initiatives and model desired behavior by communicating the benefits of new practices and providing support during the transition to reduce resistance. And involving employees at all levels in the change management process can help improve and align organizational culture. And I'll also make a note that in the years I've taken management or leadership training courses at companies, I can count on one hand the number of times I have seen an executive participate in the training. Make no mistake, the absence is felt and it sends a very negative signal in the workforce. In my experience, top executives are more in need of leadership training than anyone else in the company, and not having them work alongside their leadership teams at lower levels is a travesty. Executive participation in learning initiatives has been found to positively influence a learning culture within an organization, and evidence also suggests that a strong learning culture positively impacts a company's performance, and it can do this in a few ways. First, cross-level interactions enhance knowledge sharing and organizational innovation, improving a company's agility and ability to capitalize on turbulent or murky market conditions. Exec participation is also a strong trust builders, and there's really no need to extol the virtues of trust in leadership. I've made several videos on this topic, which you can find in my lecture series on my website. And do you remember my mention of knowledge transfer earlier? An interesting 2012 study found that a supervisory support in training programs, essentially executives showing up for and voicing their support of leadership training internally, significantly impacts knowledge transfer from training to job performance. If you are in HR or are designing learning for your organization, keep these common pitfalls in mind. If you are directly employed in an L&D role directly for your company, you are lucky and you have an incredible opportunity to affect meaningful change because you can develop full-fledged, long-term learning initiatives that can really move the needle. Now, if you're in a position where you're not in that lucky spot and you've been tasked with finding curriculum for your employees by a third party, consider whether that third party provides pre- and post-training assessments, how they actively engage learners, what their strategies are to avoid cognitive overload, how they plan to impact your company's culture, and how they're going to measure outcomes to ensure the learning objectives were met. Thank you so much for listening to this episode of the Leadership Bootcamp podcast. If you found it useful, please subscribe to the channel and share this podcast on your social media platforms. It is a really huge support.